Okay, I have 12 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. So hi, and thank you everyone for joining us today for the UNC Injury Prevention Research Center's webinar series. My name is Ciara Scott, and I am a project manager here at the center, and I will be moderating today's webinar. And so we'll begin today's webinar with just a quick welcome from Dr. Beth Morocco, who is the Associate Director of the Injury Prevention Research Center. And then she will introduce you all to our speaker for today, Dr. Venita Embry. And we'll have a very informative presentation from Dr. Embry, followed by some dedicated time for a discussion to answer questions that come up from her presentation. And then we'll wrap up today's event by just briefly forecasting our next webinar coming up in the series. And so before we get started, just some quick housekeeping for your awareness. For this first half of the webinar, we've disabled your mic and camera functions just so that we can protect the recording from any accidental interruptions. But once we get to the question and answer portion later on in the presentation, we will give you the ability to unmute to ask questions and engage with the speaker. And if you have questions that come up throughout the presentation, feel free to go ahead and start dropping those in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat and collecting those so that we can kick off the Q&A with those questions. And so now I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Beth Morocco, again, our Associate Director here at the UNC Injury Prevention Research Center.
Thanks, Ciara, and welcome everyone. It's really a pleasure to see you here today, and I'm really thrilled that Dr. Venita Embry is able to join us today. As Ciara said, I'm Beth Morocco. I'm the Associate Director here at the UNC Injury Prevention Research Center and a faculty member in the Department of Health Behavior at the UNC Gillian School of Global Public Health. The UNC Injury Prevention Research Center is one of 9 injury research centers funded by the CDC. We and Hopkins are the only 2 that have been continuously funded since 1987. So we have a long history of doing applied injury and violence prevention research and also research translation with injury and violence prevention practitioners. And we really welcome you to get involved with the center. Check out our website and feel free to contact Ciara, myself, or Dr. Steve Marshall, who's here at the webinar today as well to find out more about our center. So our webinar series, we're very excited about. We've revamped it from our IPRC seminar series. These, the purpose of the webinars are to showcase injury and violence prevention research and practice that's ongoing and cutting edge in the field. And it's also an opportunity for researchers and practitioners kind of across the spectrum of injury and violence prevention to connect, to find out what's going on, and to make connections with other folks in the field. So these webinars are 30 minutes. They're on the second Wednesday every month from 12 to 12:30. So you can be eating your lunch, taking your lunch, and enjoying injury and violence prevention research and practice at the same time. We'll be doing these webinars on the second Wednesday of the month through May, and you can check out our website to see kind of what's coming up in January and in 2023. So I'd like to go ahead and announce and introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Venita Embry, who, as I said, I'm just so thrilled to see her. I've known Venita for quite a while. She's been involved with the center for a long time. As a doctoral student, she was one of the founders of our Gender-Based Violence Research Working Group. And she also is one of in our first cohort of Injury and Violence Prevention Fellows. And so we're really happy to invite her back as a researcher coming from Research Triangle Institute. Dr. Embry is a violence and criminal justice researcher within the Center for Courts and Corrections at RTI International, and she has more than a decade of experience working with criminal justice stakeholders, individuals impacted by the criminal justice system, and vulnerable populations. She got her MPH from Emory University, and as I hinted at, her PhD from the Department of Health Behavior here at UNC. I'm also very pleased to announce that she has also been, she is now an adjunct faculty member, adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Health Behavior, and we're really excited to welcome her to the department. Dr. Embry's research expertise spans across public health and criminal justice areas to include violence prevention and intervention strategies, child maltreatment, behavioral health services, pretrial decision-making, collateral consequences of justice involvement, and the court system and programs. So you can see it spans a range of injury and violence prevention topics. She has experience applying program evaluation standards, providing technical assistance to court systems, strategizing practical and feasible recommendations for stakeholders. So all very applied work in our field. So today, Dr. Embry will be presenting on research that she's done to understand the structural context of race in domestic violence prosecution and victim cooperation. So welcome, Dr. Embry.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate the warm welcome, and also just peeked at the participant list and see a lot of familiar faces. It's also a lot of health behavior representation. So thank you for having me, and I'm going to try and seamlessly share my screen. Let's see if that works out. Okay, well, thank you. I'm just going to go ahead and jump into a presentation. I'll kind of give an overview of the review that we've conducted, and mainly a lot of it is for this talk is to talk about why we're doing this in the first place, and kind of some of the gaps we've seen. Okay, let's see. So before I dig into the actual research, I just want to acknowledge funding for this research was supported by RTI International, and I want to acknowledge my co-authors. Additionally, I just want to, again, give a major thanks to my UNC family and those who have supported me throughout the doctoral program, including Dr. Morocco, Dr. Golan, my advisor, hi, and Dr. Marshall. So the layout of this talk will be just one to provide a background about the criminal legal system's response to intimate partner violence. I'll provide some high-level findings from our state-of-the-art review, and then conclude with recommendations and areas for future research and practice. And then we'll leave time at the end for questions and answers. So just talk about the background. So as we all know, intimate partner violence is a public health and public safety issue. 41% of women and 26% of men experience some forms of contact sexual violence, physical violence, or stalking by intimate partner in their lifetime, and report a substantial impact or injuries such as physical injuries, fear of being harmed, economic impacts on their livelihood. And research has found that women of color experience higher rates of intimate partner violence. For instance, it was reported that 44% of Black women experience intimate partner violence versus 35% of white women, and that the rates of homicide, domestic violence homicide, is higher for women of color than for white women. We also found out in looking at the rates of intimate partner related homicide, 1 in 10 victims experienced some form of violence in the preceding month, which begs the question of how the impact or opportunities for intervention. Additionally, a review found that 44% of female homicides, the perpetrators had previously been arrested on DV-related charges. So they noted that there is multiple places where intervention is possible, that some of these extreme forms of injuries and death possibly have some interface with the criminal legal system. However, when we think about the legal system, one, there's often the idea of arrest, but really the full system is through the prosecution and other types of accountability. But in the research, there are a lot of gaps in the practice and knowledge. So one, it is estimated that most people who were physically assaulted by an intimate partner do not report their assault to law enforcement. So at the very first way to enter into the criminal legal system, many people are not reporting this. And that for those who are reporting, that these are more likely to be re-assaults versus the first time intimate partner violence is happening. So that begs the question of, why is there a delay? If there's injuries happening, or you're meeting a threshold for criminal intervention or legal intervention, why are people waiting until possibly there are more serious events, more a greater threat to the person and their families or more serious injury. And interestingly, we found that it's known that Black women are found to have the highest reporting rate, so they're more likely to call law enforcement calls for service for help, but there's less known about the racial differences in supporting prosecution cases. So the literature really focuses on racial differences at the point of arrest and calls for service, but less is known how Black women's support in cases involving Black women and other women of color, how they fare within the prosecution of those cases. And we argue that victim cooperation and evidence are kind of one of those more crucial elements for prosecution. So if you talk to prosecutors, they're going to say, well, we want the victim to support prosecution, we need their support, and we also need evidence. Without those, it makes the case harder to prosecute and continue. There's more likely for those cases to be declined by the prosecutor and nothing else happens. So research is needed to increase victim cooperation and the factors that impact it, particularly for women of color. And one thing I just want to note is that I do use the language victim. I know there's a lot of thoughts about the use of victim versus survivor, in particularly in the sense of a crime has been committed, harm has been done to a person. Typically, I've used victim, but there are definitely, I support the use of the survivor language, but in a criminal legal system, we typically have used victim unless there is known about the ways that they have, or they're on the path of healing and restoration. So now we'll just go into kind of what our review, the purpose of our review and some of the high-level findings. So we wanted to kind of understanding the background about domestic violence and the different rates, particularly for women of color. We wanted to understand what studies have been done to look at victim cooperation, prosecution, and race. And so we conducted a state-of-the-art review examining intimate partner violence case outcomes for 20 years, so 2000 to 2020, to explore the most current literature on this topic. And mainly we were interested in the following questions. What does the literature say about factors predicting victim cooperation? What is the association between victim cooperation and case outcomes, such as conviction, decision to prosecute, arrest outcomes? And then really, to, again, think through the racial aspect. What gaps are apparent in literature, in existing evidence regarding the influence of structural racism on outcomes in intimate partner violence cases? And that question, it probably makes more sense with the next part, which is we were really thinking as we were conceptualizing this research question and the framework of this research is that there's little known about, there's a lot of research that on the individual factors of victim cooperation and participation in the prosecution of these cases. But there's less described for those who are not seeking legal remedies. Why aren't they? What is going on with the system that they're not participating and exercising their right for to be engaged in the criminal legal system? So we wanted to explore it, and particularly we wanted to use critical race theories and Black feminist thought theories to recenter our questions. So it's not, can we find evidence of racism, but as critical race theory posits, there are subtle and systematic ways that racism exists or operates within a system such as the criminal legal system. So part of this was thinking through, how are research addressing or even starting to investigate the ways that this subtle and systematic ways that racism operates within the system. So that's our viewpoint that we purposely try to attach with our research question of really thinking about the structural factors versus just figuring out on an individual level, how is victim cooperation impacting prosecution? We also looked at Black feminist thought theories, and that way is really understanding how the experience of Black women the need to really understand the experiences of Black women and the need to pay attention to the distinct circumstances and interconnected social forces that are affecting how the system responds to their experience. So this is really focusing on Black women and other women of color, what is happening, what is part of their identity that makes it harder for them to engage with the criminal legal system. And it also counters the erasure of race and class that enables like an implicit focus on white class privileged victims. So from our review of articles from 2020, we included 25 articles. Overall, there were about 6 types of outcomes that were studied from these articles that range from the interactions with police at the scene to conviction to the victim satisfaction with overall case outcomes. 18 of these 25 studies examined some aspect of victim cooperation. And as we kind of expected, victim cooperation and support improved case processing, meaning it was able to move further down the prosecution process and an ultimate conviction or a plea agreement towards prosecuting the defendant. But however, prosecutors were less likely to proceed with a case if the victim argued against the perpetrator's arrest or citation, and less likely to obtain a conviction if the victim did not testify against the defendant. So we still see that victim cooperation was hugely important for the prosecution of domestic violence. And just here, I'm just providing kind of a list of what we found in looking at these articles of what were those factors that are associated with victim cooperation and support. So if the victim and defendant are in the same sex relationship, there is less likely to have victim cooperation for prosecution, their shared children, their prior DV incidences, which I think is important when you think about the earlier statistics presented, less severe victim injury. That is really huge because one of the main reasons that's in the literature is that the lack of being believed. So without that evidence, you're completely relying on what the victim's testimony is, which makes it very fearful to engage in the legal system without, if you're not to be believed. And then, there's a few other things, but mainly the last part, which is the victim was non-white. So non-white victims were less likely to be described as cooperative compared to white victims, pardon me. However, one thing that I really wanted to acknowledge as one of our main findings is that race throughout these articles that we examined was a very poorly measured construct, and it was poorly incorporated into the analysis. Often we included any articles that reference race, and this could be anywhere in the article. And what we found was that often race and the racial disparities of victims of color with the legal system was only mentioned in the background or maybe in the discussion. So it was really talked about more theoretically or anecdotally, but was not included in analytical designs. And for those that did include it into the design, they used a very limited race indicator such as white versus Black or white versus non-white. Race was often based on the arresting officer's perception and was not self-reported, which we can imagine there are tons of limitations and challenges with that. And when it was often included in the design, it was used as a control variable or in a simple logistic regression. So really only looking at race and how it impacted an outcome. So it really wasn't this nuanced understanding about the impacts of race and other factors. And then generally, the studies just were not centered on women of color's experiences. This is both in the way that the analysis was conducted, the design. There were no variables that included these racialized or systematic structural racism variables that was measuring those different types of aspects. It was really focused on individual level factors. So just some recommendations. One, there is a need to improve the concept of victim cooperation. So before I reported the different factors that were found to influence victim cooperation, what we found is that while there's a lot of research that talks about victim cooperation, this is not well defined. There were a few different ways that studies operationalize this. So one could be the support for legal action, such as, does this person support the arrest? Another types of ways that this was defined was through engagement. So was the victim working, providing testimony to the court? Were they meeting with the prosecutor? Were they willing to provide any other additional evidence to the prosecutor or the courts? The third other way was help seeking. So were they willing to file a protective order? And then there were actually a few number of articles that didn't even describe how this measure was constructed. And that can be very important because there's this can make a lot of impact to how do you increase victims' participation in the criminal legal system and make sure they feel supported to engage in the system if they choose to. And if we know that victim cooperation is so important, how can we really create targeted strategies without really knowing how we're defining victim cooperation? And then overall, there was just limited insights from actual victims or survivors on what matters or what impacts support and cooperation. Most of these were defined from the idea of victim cooperation was defined from the administrative data set. So this can come from law enforcement or prosecutors' notes about how they engaged the victim and how much the victim engaged with the prosecutors. The second big recommendation is to improve the research design to understand the unique experience of Black and other women of color, improve the race and racism metrics within data systems, use of theoretical frameworks that incorporates help seeking and centering the experience of those marginalized and impacted by inter-partner violence. And then lastly, identifying culturally responsive practices to increase victim support and cooperation. For sake of time, I'm just going to move along and conclude with that. Inter-partner violent arrest and prosecution play a pivotal role in reducing the recurrence of intimate partner violence, including intimate partner violence related homicides. However, there is a great need for data and research to identify and validate some of these challenges with supporting communities of color and other marginalized communities. And that many of the IPV intervention studies and scholarship has fallen outside of the legal system. So really thinking about community responses and screening. This is a passion area for prosecutors. It's very dangerous and for law enforcement. So really the question is, how can we increase researcher and practitioner collaboration? And how can we apply public health principles and concepts to this area? I know that was a mouthful, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you all may have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Embry. That was great. It was a lot of interesting information. So yes, now is the time for questions. So there are none currently in the chat. If you do have questions, you can feel free to drop them in the chat. And I also have now enabled the unmute function. So you can also feel free to unmute and ask your question directly to Dr. Embry.
This is Stephanie. Venita, how are you doing?
Good, how are you?
I enjoyed your talk. I had a quick question. Have you thought about next steps in research?
Yes. So one of the things that I'm most interested in is that last point about the culturally, I'm really interested in moving towards the equitable solution. So, you know, there are plenty of practices that are anecdotally known to not be supportive of victim cooperation. So there's a stronger need to research and to work with prosecutors to improve their data collection systems. The more I work with prosecutors and defenders, the more I'm shocked about how poorly their data systems are. So there's a need to, one, work with these offices to make sure they're collecting the metrics so that we can understand the extent of these issues. To make sure we really understand the needs of victims and survivors, making sure that they're collected and kind of providing a more holistic defense. So I'm really interested in future research that is engaging with prosecutors to create more victim survivor-centered services. And then also, engaging or identifying ways within these prosecutors' office to change the culture. So there's one of the resources that I have listed as a reference. There are a few recommendations that are out there for how to increase practices, including having a more diverse prosecutor field. The field of defense, prosecution, judge, everything is disproportionately white, and that can be isolating for communities of color, especially when there's language barriers. Again, that feeling of being judged and not believed is such a strong barrier. So the more that these offices can create a culture that makes people feel welcome, to meet people where they are, to understand how that shared cultural understanding is super important. And that's kind of where I'm interested in, is how do you build those bridges and, you know, create a more supportive victim advocacy program within prosecutor's office.
That's great. And just a follow-up question, have you thought about potential collaborations at the law school?
No, I haven't actually. I'm interested if there's any particular thought that will be, I love collaborations, and I know Beth Morocco, she's definitely worked with the law school, and I would be interested in figuring out how we can better utilize joint knowledge versus recreating the wheel.
Great, thanks.
So do we have time for one more question? Oh, there's one. I'll wait because I can talk to Venita later, but let's take Shanna's question.
Okay. So in the chat, Shanna has a question. She was wondering if you could come across differences in the, or if you had come across differences in the levels of community violence and that relationship with violence in the home. And she's curious if communities experiencing higher levels of violence may be more reluctant to report, and how that differs by race and ethnicity.
Yeah, I'm thinking, I've seen articles, I cannot remember the findings of those, and that because we were really focused on the policies within the offices themselves and the culture and their experiences with the prosecutor's office, I didn't include that in this presentation. I think that that's definitely a huge area. I mean, I think that the sentiment, or at least the theory, is that communities that have been over-policed, that have been those who have family that has in a network that has been affected by mass incarceration, police violence, that impacts the decision to seek those services. For separate projects, you know, we are talking to folks about, hey, do you want to be on a jury? And then we would talk to communities of color. They would say the courthouse is a very traumatizing place. Even if you do not come in for, you know, you're the defendant, just to go in to, you know, update records or serve in a jury is a place of trauma. And so I think that that is something that is kind of one of those ideas that kind of made me interested in this. Like, are those even being addressed in the research? And what we found are no. Some studies have looked at neighborhood level factors that are associated with victimization and prosecution or arrest rates, but again, they're still not thinking about those structural factors, because at the end of the day, you can still say these neighborhoods have a problem and that they're not willing to address it, but you're not really considering some of those structural factors of why communities are reluctant to seek legal remedies, or even some certain types of community responses. They just feel like are not for them. That was a long-winded answer.
Beth, if you want to ask your question, I think we can shake it.
That's okay. I can follow up with Venita. Thank you, though.
All right. Any other final questions? We may not have much time left to discuss, but if you do have questions, you can put them in the chat. And if we can't answer them now, Dr. Embry can follow up after the webinar.
Yes. Thank you for having me. And please, I'm happy to answer any additional questions via email, my contact information.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Embry. So before we close for today, I just wanted to forecast our next webinar. So our next webinar for this webinar series is going to be on Wednesday, January 11th at the same time. That will be a presentation from Dr. Renee Johnson, and she's going to be presenting on her overdose response evaluation work that she's done in Maryland. And so I'll be sending a follow-up email to all of you after this webinar, and it'll include the link to register for that presentation. And so if you're interested in keeping up with our webinar series, you can always find the schedule on our website. And so I'm dropping a link in the chat to that. And just lastly, I'm also going to drop a link in the chat to a post-evaluation survey. If you have time, we would really appreciate if you could just take a minute or two to just respond to that brief survey so that we can continue to collect helpful information that will inform our future presentations that we have in this series. So that is all the time that we have for today. We're exactly at 12:30. Thank you all for joining us. And again, thank you, Dr. Embry, for a wonderful presentation. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. And happy holidays. We'll see everyone in January who comes to the next webinar. Thank you.